We don't know what Charlotte Brontë was thinking when she sat down to write Jane Eyre and decided to have Bertha Mason, the infamous mad woman in the attic, the villain of the piece, to have her come from Jamaica. We don't know it was Bronte's intention to replicate imperialist English stereotypes about people from the Caribbean as savage and other. But that doesn't mean we can't point out that replicating these stereotypes is what Jane Eyre does. We have the right to point that out, no matter what the intention behind it was. And that is death of the author. Welcome, fellow creatures of the night, to this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Here we venture deep into the nocturnal lands of the strange, the morbid, the absurd and the obscure in film, books, TV, fairy tales, urban legends, and many other forms of pop culture. We discuss and analyze these texts to explore the fascinating ways they reflect, comment on, and critique the world we live in from its darker side. I am Xenia, our over-motivated master of ceremonies, who happens to be talking right now, but who you're always welcome to disagree with, and I declare this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club officially in session. Tonight, my bats and cats and kittens, I'd like to talk to you about a term that I've come across a lot over the past year or so in places like YouTube video titles, in online commentary, on social media. I've most commonly seen this term in connection with disgraced authors, or what we call disgraced authors. This can be people who have revealed themselves to be terrible, from being hateful bigots to straight up criminals. Is that the rain? Just started pissing it down like crazy this exact moment. Enjoy the free, rainy autumn ambience, I suppose. I was talking about a term that I haven't told you yet, but you'll see it in the title. A term that is often used at the moment online when we talk about disgraced authors, and as I said, they can be anything from hateful bigots to straight up criminals, allegedly, because of course they're not being legally prosecuted, because that would be too fair and too, just, and that is something that unfortunately doesn't happen often enough in this world. But these controversies and allegations, let alone these people, aren't the topic of this episode. They are merely the reason why I've seen the term, the concept I want to talk about tonight, around a lot, and I remembered how essential it is to all of media analysis and criticism, and therefore to us here on this podcast. And that is the wonderful concept of death of the author. The storm keeps intensifying, my dear friends. I hope it doesn't bother you. Now, an important thing to note, there is a difference in how the term death of the author is often used in the media, in online spaces like what I mentioned, like YouTube videos and social media. There's a big difference between that and what the term was originally coined to mean. So what I'll introduce in this episode might be different to the way you've seen the term used before. But both uses are really worth talking about, so I'll touch on the pop culture use for a little bit as well. And the reason why I want to talk about both is for two reasons. The first reason is that I find it really fascinating how terms that come from specific fields, like death of the author that comes from literary studies, that these terms can take on different meanings when they enter the wider public sphere. How their presence in the accessible space of the internet modifies their meanings and the way they are applied. Like this, we can watch the principle of language always being defined by the way it is used more than by rules and prescriptions. In real time, we can see meanings emerge based on how people use words. And as someone who's interested in language and society and communication, I find that really, really cool. The second reason I want to talk about death of the author, and here that's mostly about the original concept of death of the author, is because it is what the whole of this podcast is founded on. None of these episodes would exist without death of the author. In fact, the whole field of literary studies and cultural studies as we know them today would not exist. They would be far more narrow and restricted to a fraction of what they are. And I think because of this, we should take a closer look at what death of the author is all about. So what we'll do in this episode is we will look at the different meanings and uses of the term death of the author, so its pop culture use and its academic use. And then we'll dive a little bit deeper into the theoretical idea of death of the author, and we'll look at some examples that show the possibilities we get from practicing this concept, and that also demonstrate its limits, where it stops being useful. And finally, we'll discuss why the death of the author is the birth of the reader. So let's start with a couple of definitions. Don't worry, it's not going to be boring. First, I want to talk about what so far I've called the pop culture definition of death of the author. And this is really just based on my own impressions and observations of how I've seen this term used. It's not, a scientific reasoning or anything like that. So if you've perceived it differently, or if you've seen examples that use it in a completely different way, that's perfectly fine. It's really just a subjective impression, and I couldn't really find a definition for this pop culture use anywhere, so I kind of came up with my own. As I said, I've specifically seen the term death of the author used in the context of disgraced authors, and here it kind of becomes a term of ethical judgment. It is a term that is used when an author has done something that causes readers to turn away from them, to no longer support them, and to no longer buy or platform their work. It often goes hand in hand with people expressing their disappointment or anger at the person. In short, I would summarize this use of the term death of the author as a kind of response to the fall of a hero, an expression of personal disappointment. I've also noticed that the term death of the author here is also often used sort of hand in hand with the whole separating the art from the artist debate. And this, of course, is also a topic that often comes up when authors do something terrible in real life. And we as readers who maybe enjoyed their work, we kind of have to integrate this horrible reality with the image we had of them before, of someone who created things that we loved, someone we maybe even admired. And of course, something like that will lead to a lot of dissonance and tension in ourselves. If your favorite author turns out to, I'm just going to make up an example, if your favorite author turns out to be violent to their partner or their children, and you absolutely love their work, that will cause tension in you and dissonance, and you will not, it will be difficult to bring those two images together, right? It makes sense that in this context, the separating the art from the artist debate comes up and becomes very, very important, because that is essentially what it is about. Can we and do we want to separate someone's actions in real life from their creative work? Now, in my experience, the position that art cannot be separate from the artist, people who make that point tend to use the death of the author term with this new meaning that I've seen around, which in a sense is funny because the term was originally supposed to mean kind of the opposite, but also not really. You'll see. I think what is happening here with this pop culture use is that people kind of reverse engineer a new meaning for a term that has been floating around for longer, that they may have heard somewhere in a different context, and then they create a new meaning for it based on what makes sense to them and what the term sounds like, and of course based on what they want to express. So my hypothesis about this new pop culture use of death of the author in a kind of fall of the hero context is that, and this is completely made up of thoughts in my brain, this is not backed up by anything. So my hypothesis is that this meaning comes from the similarity to the phrase "this person is dead to me." And given that, death of the author sounds quite similar to something like this author is dead to me, I think it makes a lot of sense that the term kind of took on this meaning as well. You look at the term and you see, okay, it could mean this. It could mean this author is now dead to me. Or they've done something that has caused their downfall and like the death of their career or something like that. So that's how I believe this new usage came about. Now, very importantly, I don't want this to sound as if I think this reverse engineering of meaning is a bad thing. It's absolutely not. It's completely normal. It's how language works and how language has always worked. Language is always fluid and changing and adapting to the communicative needs of the people who are using the language. Through this we create new terms when a new concept becomes important, or a new emotion, or a new invention, or sometimes a term becomes a little bit obsolete. We don't really need it anymore, and then it can take on a different meaning. And apparently in this situation, where maybe also with the rise of cancel culture, I don't really think that a lot of people are actually being cancelled. There's just a bit of outrage and then somehow they go back to doing their thing. But with this arising culture of trying to find out what people have done in their personal life who have created certain works and giving that a lot of importance, in this culture it makes a lot of sense that people needed a term to express this disappointment and anger at, somebody they previously looked up to, an artist whose work they enjoyed falling from grace. This is where the linguistics part of my degree shines through, can you tell? And what's really cool? That in engineering this meaning, by interpreting and using the term in their own way, how people kind of made it their own and gave it a meaning based on what they read out of what it looks like. Readers, funnily enough, enact the exact practice that death of the author was initially coined to mean. So, what was death of the author originally coined to mean, you may ask, because I've been avoiding answering that question for like 15 minutes now. Well, I'm not going to tell you yet, because first I'm going to tell you a little bit about what it might not be. Because death of the author is a term that people in culture and media circles like to argue about, I was curious about what the general interpretation of it is. So I went to the most reliable source of all, the Urban Dictionary. That's not true, that's a lie. Initially I was hoping that someone had summarized the disgraced author use of the term there, and that's why I went to Urban Dictionary. I didn't find that, but I found this gem that leads us very well into the literary theory definition and the reason why people fight about death of the author so much. So this is a definition from the Urban Dictionary. A pretentious postmodern jerk-off idea, popular among some academics, that says that the creator of an artistic work is irrelevant to the work, that their thought processes and intentions in creating the work don't matter, that they are not an authority on the very thing that they created, and that you, in all caps, the passive consumer of the work, are more qualified to know what the work is about than they are, who put tons of hard work and effort into creating it. Death of the author says that creators are just passive, empty vessels through which the divine muse speaks. You can probably tell this person is not a fan of Death of the Author. And this is great because they have produced an excellent example of a common misunderstanding of Death of the Author that is really useful to explain what Death of the Author does and doesn't mean. First of all, this definition gets a couple of things right. Death of the author is indeed a postmodern idea from academia. That's completely correct. Postmodernism is an approach to literature that followed and kind of updated the previous structuralist school of literary analysis. Structuralism was based on the principle that as readers we should try to decipher the signs the author deliberately put into a text to then find the one correct and intended interpretation of the text. So it's like somebody setting a puzzle and you have to solve it. I think a perfect example for this, or for someone having this attitude, is the teacher in this blue curtains English teacher joke. You know, the one that is like, the curtains are blue because the author wants to tell us that the person in the scene is sad. That would be a very kind of structuralist reading, to look at the evidence in the text, look at the color and be like, oh, this is what the author wanted to tell us with that. Now, postmodernism does something a little bit different. Postmodernism uses the same reading signs in the text strategy, but it looks for things like disruptions and contradictions and different possibilities, maybe things that are ambiguous or that kind of go against a common understanding of the text. So instead of looking for one perfect intended meaning, they look at a patchwork of different meanings and different elements that together create, you know, something that's not quite as clear cut, but usually sort of ambiguous and complex. And this is also a reason why postmodernism likes to bring in marginalized perspectives into their literary analysis. You know, it is this movement that brought us post-colonial analysis or feminist analysis or queer theory, you know, different ways of approaching a book or film or whatever it is, and looking for all sorts of influences, focusing on different elements in the text, and, you know, looking at different perspectives that might notice different things in the same work, instead of looking for one correct meaning. The second thing this definition gets right is that the author is not the authority on how a book or a film or a TV series that they created is to be interpreted. Death of the Author does say that. It says that, you know, the author's intentions do not determine how we have to understand the work. And the third thing that the definition gets right about Death of the Author is that the reader can know things about the work that the author doesn't know. We'll get a bit more into what that actually means in a minute. But first I want to talk about what the definition gets wrong. The creator and their ideas and intentions are not irrelevant, according to Death of the Author. They just aren't the only one. They aren't more relevant than the effect the finished work ends up having. The author isn't all-knowing and all-powerful. They might not be in complete control over every little thing of their work. The effect of the work, the thing that a reader gets out of a book, for example, is more important than the author's intentions. But that doesn't mean that the author's intentions have to be ignored completely. Another thing that is not quite correct here is that the creator is not a passive empty vessel, according to Death of the Author. That's not true. The creator is absolutely the creator of the work and responsible for it and responsible for what's in it. They do have intentions and they do make deliberate choices. Death of the Author doesn't say that a creator doesn't do that. And finally, the most important thing that this definition misunderstands is that, according to Death of the Author, the consumer is not passive. On the contrary, the consumer is not a consumer at all. They are a reader. They are somebody who actively engages with the work. They don't just drink it down like a glass of soda. They engage with it. They create meaning by interacting with a book or a film or a song that they listen to. The work itself can only do so much until somebody reads it and interprets it and engages with it. That is what creates meaning. So there is no consumer, there is an active reader. But let's get a bit more specific than this. Death of the Author was a concept formally defined by a man called Roland Barthes, who was a French literary theorist who, fun fact, came out to the public as gay by writing a funny little book with some subtle jokes in there. Iconic. Also, his birthday was on the best of days, the 12th of November, like my birthday. So apparently it is the day of literature-obsessed Scorpios. So a fantastic day. Thank you very much. Barthes formulated the concept of Death of the Author in an essay published in 1967. This essay also has the title Death of the Author, so we know what he's talking about. Very useful. Basically, the concept that he describes was not invented by Brontë then. It's always existed. It's the thing that readers have always done when reading or watching a play or listening to music. We've always done that. We've always thought about and came up with our own ideas about art that we looked at. But Brontë was the first to kind of package it into a neat concept with a name and a definition. So very simply put, Brontë death of the author means that it is the work that matters and what a reader gets out of a work, not what the author intends for them to get out of the work. The actual effect of the text is more important than the intention of the author. And Brontë says that his aim with formulating this term was to get readers to move away from this widespread idea of a powerful genius creator of great importance whose authority you're not allowed to question. You know, a view where only the creator can explain the work and the consumer has to listen to what the author says because the author must always be right about their work. They are almost a sort of like a godlike figure that we're not allowed to question. Now, according to Brontë, this idea of the author as creator and the reader as passive consumer who has to have meaning explained and fed to them is a fundamentally capitalistic and very modern perspective on art, where art is seen as a consumer product that we just shove into our face and that's it, that we're not clever enough to understand on our own terms. We just have it served to us and devour it, and then that's it. But if we actively engage with it, we don't just swallow the work. We don't just swallow the meaning that the author, the godlike creator, serves to us on a silver platter, but we make our own meaning by engaging in interpretation. And in this view of the all-knowing author and us as just passive consumers, interpretation is, and I've said this before about structuralism, is just a deciphering of the meaning the author deliberately encoded. We try to correctly find this intended meaning. That's the end and the only one correct reading done. It's a little bit boring. What Brontë proposes is that for us to be able to do more thorough interpretation, to look at texts from different perspectives than just this one looking for the intended meaning perspective. To do that, the overlord version of the author has to die. The author has to die so the reader, in their creativity and their multitude of ideas and thoughts, can live. Brontë says that it is language which speaks, not the author. The text matters. And now a text is no text ever, no single text is ever like a brand new child burst by the author that is entirely new and has nothing to do with things that have existed before it, like Adam made by God from scratch. You know, a book, for example, isn't something that the creator has just pulled out of thin air. It is something that creatively combines things that are already around and that already have cultural significance. Things like tropes, themes, topics from the culture surrounding the work, styles of representing something. You know, they are, for example, the sonnet. The sonnet is a form of poem that for a long time was used only for love stories, right? And for example, Shakespeare, he wrote a lot of sonnets, but in his play Romeo and Juliet, which I am sure you know, he used the format of a sonnet for the first 14 lines that Romeo and Juliet speak to one another. So he uses this format of this poem that is established as a love poem in culture to have these two characters speak to each other for the first time. So as someone who watches the play and picks up on that, you will notice, this is going to be the big love story in this tale. You know, there are so many nuances that you can use here. It's fascinating. And actually, I want to stay with Romeo and Juliet for a second because I think it's a great example for how nothing is ever completely new and it always references things that have already existed. Every single story of star-crossed lovers in a European or Western reader will automatically invoke the probably best known story of star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet, because it is so culturally relevant that if we watch a film about a young couple that is held apart by their families or other factors beyond their control, it will remind us of Romeo and Juliet. And even the term star-crossed lovers, which, has become a kind of staple expression to mean that lovers are kept apart by fate or other unfortunate circumstances, that their stars are not aligned. This term actually goes back to Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So even the phrase itself comes from a different story. And this story, Romeo and Juliet, itself was inspired by the Greek myth of Pyramus and Thisbe, which has existed thousands of years before Shakespeare, and he drew on this because it was a cultural sign that already existed, and he used this already existing meaning to weave something new from these existing signs. And those are only two examples. There are many, many other tales from mythology from across the world. We actually spoke about a star-crossed lovers story in a different episode of Midnight Culture Club, which is a Chinese tale about a couple who want to be together but are kept apart by societal standards and family issues and stuff like that, who are often referred to as the Chinese Romeo and Juliet. So, you see how these things are always interlinked and always referencing one another and building on meaning that already exists and complicating it and adding to it. No work of art exists in a vacuum. They're all connected to others that came before them, and they continue to weave this rich tapestry of images and references and tropes to continue building on them and creating a bigger and more rich and complex image. Another thing that's really important to understand about Death of the Author is that Brontë says that the text is not finished with the writing. A work is made new whenever somebody reads it. It doesn't have one stable meaning determined by the god author, but its meaning changes depending on who the audience is, on what their background is, and also how the context of the work changes over time. We see this every time we watch a TV show from, the early 2000s and think to ourselves, oh, that joke really didn't age well. You couldn't say that today. And the reason for that thought is that you are a different audience to the audience who first consumed the text, or I shouldn't say consumed, engaged with the text, and you make a different meaning out of it than they did back then, because things have changed. Back then there were so many transphobic jokes, for example, in sitcoms, and nowadays a lot of people, when they hear these jokes, will be like, oh, that's not a good thing to say. We are making a new meaning for it based on our background and based on what we've learned, and that is great. We are just looking at it with our background that's different to the background then. And this idea that every reader makes a work anew means that there are many, many possibilities of interpreting the same film, painting, song, or TV show. Meaning is multidimensional, and that also points out that different readers' meanings can blend and clash, and that doesn't mean that any of them are wrong. There is space in all dimensions to create meaning and to have different interpretations. Every reader can interpret the work for themselves, and readers will interpret the work for themselves differently because they have different knowledge, different background, different experiences, and that is enriching. Now, the point of this whole Operation Death of the Author is essentially to liberate the reader, so they don't have to see themselves as passive consumers, but as active agents with possibilities, to draw things out of text, to find ambiguities, to find double meanings, to find different perspectives, to, focus on different details in the same text. You don't actually have to contradict someone someone else's reading just because yours is different. You might have just looked at different details, and we will actually get an example later on, actually 2 examples, that show us how different perspectives, can arise without either of them being wrong or right, just based on people focusing on different details. And what is important as well is that when Brontë talks about the reader, he doesn't mean one single reader or an ideal reader, which is something that we also often, a term that you often hear, who are you writing for, who's your ideal reader? But instead what Brontë means here with the reader in this context is a collective reader, a multitude of readers who together find a plethora of traces and significant details. Those who are overlooked or ignored when we try to only decipher the author's meaning. Details that the author and some readers may not even be able to notice themselves because they are there intuitively, because in their time and place it was just common sense to include them, but it isn't to someone else. All these readings together, of these active readers with their own backgrounds and interests and varieties of knowledge and experience, they create something larger and more insightful than any individual person, author, or reader ever could. And if a work inspires all these different interpretations, that is also kind of a badge of honor for the work. In the preface of The Picture of Dorian Gray, Oscar Wilde writes, "Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex, and vital." And this is a statement I absolutely agree with, because in order for a work to spark discussion, to spark this blending and clashing of opinions that Brontë talks about, for readers to be able to find a lot of different interpretations, for that the work needs to have complexity and originality. If there is only one possible interpretation, this means that there is nothing to explore and to discuss. If everything is obvious, the work is probably a bit flat and a bit boring. If you create something and people discuss it and disagree about it, that is not an insult. It means that you have created something that's really, really interesting. Sometimes there are some limitations to this, you'll see. So, if we search for only one meaning, the one intended by the author, we force the work to be flat and one-dimensional, even if maybe it isn't. So, we are denying interesting works their interestingness, and that's not cool. Oscar Wilde would be mad at you. You don't want to make Oscar Wilde mad, do you? You want to make Oscar Wilde happy. You want him to look at you and be like, I'm proud of this child. Excellent outfit, good green carnation, likes fighting about literature, 10 out of 10. This, however, does not mean that every interpretation is equally valid, or that every opinion about a work needs to be respected. That's not what Death of the Author means. Just because people fight about something, that doesn't always mean that all their positions make sense. But whether they make sense doesn't depend on whether the interpretation agrees with the author's intention. An interpretation is meaningful if it is based on the actual text, if it, consists of a careful reading of the clues that exist in the text. Before we can put our opinion into the world, we actually need to engage with what we're talking about. In the sense of Brontë, we need to think about it and interpret it, and valid readings need to be backed up by evidence from the text, and they can't just be the result of prejudice or preconceived notions. There is a current very good example for this blending and clashing of both well thought out readings and preconceived notions that are not really readings. And that is Sabrina Carpenter's much discussed album cover for A Man's Best Friend that sparked insane amount of discussion and definitely a lot of diversity of opinions. So according to Oscar Wilde, Sabrina definitely did it right. She created something new and vital. So she's got Oscar's approval, which is excellent, which is what we all want. But maybe first I should briefly describe, in case you haven't seen it, but you probably have, even I have seen the album cover. I should probably describe it. So, this album cover that was released earlier in the summer for Sabrina Carpenter's album Man's Best Friend, it basically shows her on the floor on all fours in a black dress, and she has her hair is open, and she looks at the camera in a way that could be seen as maybe a little bit flirty or sort of a little bit seductive, but also that is very straightforward. So she looks directly at us, the viewer, and standing in front of her, standing up there is a man, or what I assume to be a man, who holds up like a fistful of her hair. That's the front. On the back there is a little dog tag where you see a close-up picture of a dog and a dog tag, and the tag is in the shape of a heart, and it says Man's Best Friend, which is the title of the album. This album cover caused drama that I have never seen before about an album cover. I have to say, disclaimer, I feel very neutral about Sabrina Carpenter. I'm not a fan, I don't particularly like her music, but I also don't have anything bad to say about her, I feel very neutral about her, which is why I think this is a good example for me personally to talk about, because I don't have any strong opinions about it. I think that's useful here. But what even I know, and I think this is useful context to look at the cover, is that Sabrina Carpenter's music often deals with sex and relationships with men, and that she often uses humor and irony to make her point. And that already brings us to one popular interpretation of the cover art. And that is that the image is a satire of how the public, especially the male public, sees her as a sort of sexy and sexualized blonde bombshell with a certain level of submissiveness, which is expressed by her being down on the floor, whereas the man in front of her is standing up and holding her hair. That maybe a lot of men see her as someone they like to imagine in that kind of submissive sexualized position, and that this desire reflects the patriarchal tendency to subjugate and sexualize women at the same time. I think we can see these signs in the image, right? But the medium of satire here is important, because if we look at it as satire, that means that the image deliberately replicates and kind of exaggerates something. In this case, this kind of sexual objectification of Sabrina. It replicates and exaggerates this so it can criticize it. That's what the medium of satire in general does, right? Exaggerate in order to criticize. That's also why it's often used sort of like in political contexts and so on, because you can kind of humorously criticize things that might be more difficult to criticize if you did it kind of straight up. And I think that the medium of satire fits really well with Sabrina Carpenter's kind of signature ironic humor, and also the very stylized and carefully planned way of presentation that she uses. If you look at clips of her live shows, they are very choreographed, and there's a huge set, and it's all very well planned and thought through, right? She's not someone who does things, without thinking about them first. Same when you look at her music videos, they are very well produced and very carefully thought out. And so basically this satire interpretation of the image says that she plays with this idea of her as this sexy blonde bombshell and female sexual submissiveness, and exaggerates it in the image in order to criticize the way people look at her. This is actually something that she does and that she plays with in the music video for A Man-Child that came out about the same time as the album cover. So I think this reading also takes that into account. This satire reading is one that many of her fans have put forward, and I think it makes sense that with background knowledge about her work, her other forms of presenting herself, when you know about the irony and the humor she uses a lot, I think it makes sense that people familiar with her came up with this reading. They kind of have her personal context to use to put this image into, They use their impressions of her other work as an additional source that helps them analyze this cover with context, rather than as a standalone piece. You know, it's part of a series of her works, and by looking at the other works, they can, you know, extrapolate that this very likely also has this humorous, ironic, critical tone about it. A second reading of the image that I've seen a lot from Sabrina's fans online is that the cover is a form of sexual self-expression and self-acceptance. And because of this, it is an empowering act on her part. I think this reading can be supported by the image, you know, by the fact that she looks directly at the camera in a very confident way, rather than to cast her glance down in a sort of submissive expression. Or she could also be looking up at the person holding her hair, focusing on them. She doesn't do that. She looks at us. By looking into the camera, she actively interacts with the viewer. We don't just gaze upon her, safe from the subject position of the camera that puts her into an object position that we're looking at, but she gazes straight back at us. This could mean that, you know, she reclaims her subjecthood and her agency by holding our gaze that tries to stare her down, in a sense. It kind of says, I am here because I choose to be here, and I can see exactly that you're looking at me. And you're looking at me the way I choose to have you look at me. It's very clever. This actually goes into Laura Mulvey's theory of the male gaze that we talked about in the Peeping Tom episode. If you're interested and want to know more about film and objectification and power and the gaze of the camera, it works really well in this context to look at it as a staring back into the face of this objectifying male gaze. Now, I could imagine either of these interpretations being intended by the author, aka Sabrina and her team, maybe a combination of them too. We don't know that. I'm just saying this to show you that if we were to look for the intended meaning, I don't think we would be able to decide which one of these two it is. I think they are both plausible. What is more important for us is that both of these readings can be backed up well by the image itself and the surrounding context of Sabrina's work overall. As I said, I would consider them both valid readings. They engage with the text carefully and critically. Even if, let's say, Sabrina makes a statement that her intention was satire, the second reading of her expressing herself and claiming her own sexual subjecthood would still be a valid reading. It wouldn't be incorrect or bad or anything. It would still be an interpretation that is well thought out and that makes sense based on the image, and therefore a valid interpretation. And even a more critical reading that I've seen a lot in like comments stuff can be backed up well, in my opinion. And that is a common criticism that I've seen come from women, that they find the image kind of a little bit disrespectful or even degrading. And their criticism here was that the image reproduces typical depictions of women that are intended to objectify them, that are created for male pleasure and male voyeurism. After all, the picture does show an attractive young woman kneeling before what can be assumed to be a man who holds on to her in a controlling way, in a controlling gesture, and she looks at the viewer with an expression that could be interpreted as flirty and inviting. It is a little bit reminiscent of things like Playboy shoots or adverts, where pictures of attractive women presented in a sexualized way are used to sell products. Now, this is a reading that doesn't focus as much on Sabrina Carpenter, but that puts the image into a larger societal context where these kinds of images are common in an objectifying manner. It's an interpretation that can be well argued for, even though it contradicts the two readings we've looked at before, and it most certainly is not the author's intention. Now, in my opinion, and that's just my opinion, you can disagree, these three are all examples of valid readings of the album cover backed up by the text. Now, let's have a fourth example, one that I think is not a valid reading, but that has unfortunately floated around the internet all the same, because I want to show you what the difference is. This interpretation, in quotation marks, is very simple. It understands Sabrina Carpenter as an immoral, lewd person, some would say a slut, with no self-respect, who is simply aiming to gain male attention and validation and wealth, which for some reason in this view makes her worth less. This is not a valid reading in my opinion, because it is just a replication of a stereotype. It's unreflected, it's not thought through at all. It draws on something that the other readings draw as well. It draws on the idea that it is a sexualized image to some degree. But it notices that the image resembles ways of depicting women that are kind of meant to be kind of sexy and inviting and maybe used for, selling something to men. But this interpretation, instead of looking into why the album art creates that impression and what the cultural context is and what the effects are, that, as I said, can be understood differently, but it doesn't even try to look into them. This reading just goes, hot woman must be slut. It is based purely on misogyny and the resulting idea that women's entire existence circle around men, and that their attractiveness and sexuality is only for men and not for themselves. To me, it is not a reading, it's just a repetition of patriarchal stereotypes. It doesn't mean that any reading that is rooted in patriarchal beliefs is instantly wrong, but you still need to do a bit of actual thinking. The second reason why I think this is not a valid reading is because it is just a personal attack on the creator. It doesn't criticize the work, it attacks the creator. And death of the author absolutely does not mean that you get to personally insult the creator. You are analyzing and critiquing a text, not personally insulting an artist. That's a very important distinction. Just because you're allowed to disagree with an artist or other people's opinions, that doesn't mean that you have to attack anyone personally. I'm sure we can all tell the difference between this example and the other valid and well-reasoned readings. The difference is not whether the reading looks for Sabrina's intended meaning, but the difference is that some people thought about the image, thought about specific elements and how they can be connected with other culturally significant images, some specific to the author, some more general, and they drew informed conclusions from all that work. And others simply voiced their first superficial impulse and did it disrespectfully on top of that. This doesn't mean that sometimes personal criticism isn't appropriate. It's perfectly fair to look at, for example, the way J.K. Rowling names characters in the most stereotypical ways. The Cho Changs and Seamus Finnegans. This is like absolute cliches for in this case Chinese and Irish people. And then on top of that, she also gave these characters really prejudiced and insensitive cliche qualities, like the said Seamus Finnegan, the Irish kid, being ginger and likes to make stuff explode in reference to the IRA's bombings during the Troubles. If you look at an author's work and you notice patterns like this and deduce from that, okay, this person seems to be quite racist, for example, that is perfectly fine. But again, you have to look carefully and think about it and then draw an informed conclusion. It also depends in which context they do this. Do they do it deliberately? Is it, meant to be ridiculous and over the top? Is it meant to be exaggerated? Or is it serious? But again, you might come up with different interpretations. But what I want to say is that if we notice patterns of authors doing the same things over and over again, I think it is fair to draw conclusions like, oh, this appears to be this author's opinion on something. But back to Sabrina. Of course, what I presented here are just my readings of the readings that I saw on the internet. You can probably think of other ways to look at them. You can probably think of other ways to interpret Sabrina Carpenter's album cover, and you may think that the way I judge these different readings isn't complete or faulty or stupid, and that is your right. And I'd be happy to hear your reading of the image or your criticisms of my readings and the way I presented them here. I'd be happy to hear them because you will certainly add something new that I haven't thought of before. And that is fantastic. That is the point. Because Death of the Author is not about being the only one who's right. It's about discussion and meaning making and enriching the cultural world by talking about it. And very importantly, death of the author is not an attack on the creator of a work. Somebody saying respectfully that to them Sabrina Carpenter's album cover looks like the many objectifying, degrading images of sexualized, submissive women that exist out there in the media landscape is not an attack on Sabrina Carpenter. It is someone pointing out that this connection exists and it is one possible way to understand the image, and that is the way that they understood it. That this reading is possible based on the image doesn't mean that the creator, Sabrina Carpenter, is against women's rights or something like that, or that she's a bad person, or whatever I've seen people say on the internet. One possible reading of many doesn't determine the quality of an author's character. It just means that, in this case, the image visually cites other images that are generally seen as objectifying, and that to some viewers the album cover will look objectifying because of that. It doesn't mean she's not allowed to express herself that way. That is a whole other approach that has nothing to do with the death of the author. Death of the author does not try to limit artists. It doesn't kill off creativity or the meaning of writing, painting, composing. Artists can still do whatever they want. They just don't get to tell readers, viewers how to understand their works. Death of the author only kills off the idealized, all-knowing, godlike author who dictates meaning, so that readers are not just passive consumers, but active, inquisitive, curious, and capable. Readers can be alive. And because of this, death of the author is the basis of all literary analysis that looks for something other than the author's intention. It allows us to look at works from a perspective or with a focus the author didn't think of, because no human being alone can consciously think of all the multitudes that something like a novel or an album contains. It opens up new perspectives. A good example for this, I think, is that death of the author is extremely important for post-colonial literary analysis. Post-colonial literary theory aims to specifically study what works that are not obviously about colonialism tell us about colonialism. And one book that has been given a completely new dimension by post-colonial theory, by a new approach, is Charlotte Bronte's classic novel Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is first and foremost a Gothic romance about a young governess, Jane Eyre, who takes a job at the house of a wealthy man called Rochester to teach a girl he has taken in. There are mysterious goings-on at this house. Rochester is clearly hiding something, and Jane tries to find out what is going on. During this, Jane and Rochester fall in love with each other. Towards the end of the novel, Rochester's secret is revealed. His ex-wife, Bertha, who he met as a young man when he was in Jamaica for a while, Bertha has gone mad and he now hides her in the attic of his vast house. It is Bertha who is responsible for the ominous events in the house, because she sometimes escapes from her chamber to do wild stuff like creeping around and setting things on fire. She is the original infamous mad woman in the attic. And many readings of Jane Eyre focus on conventions of the Gothic genre, with its hero and villain in one male lead, Rochester, with its focus on secrecy, madness, or the kind of femininity the frail, pure Jane represents. These are all very interesting things to look into. It can also be assumed that the effects of mystery and tension that the Gothic genre creates were used deliberately by Charlotte Brontë. But that doesn't mean that that's all we're allowed to look at. There is so much more. Because post-colonial literary analysis has looked at Jane Eyre from a fresh and fascinating perspective. Because they put Bertha as the antithesis of Jane in the novel in the center of their interpretations. Bertha is a white woman, but she was born and raised in Jamaica. Her family has lived there for a longer period of time. They are so-called Creole people, European Caribbeans who speak a different type of English to Jane and Rochester, who are used to a different climate, different food, who have a different culture to the English. And the fact that the secret mad other woman, the dark side of the story, the villain who tries to come between Jane and Rochester, a woman who is defined clearly against the European British self, is meaningful, and post-colonial theory first unearthed this meaning. They focused on the way that Bertha's colonial otherness is used in the novel to make her strange and unrelatable, to highlight her madness, her uncontrolled nature, the opposite of Jane, the controlled, calm English self. We don't know what Charlotte Brontë was thinking when she sat down to write Jane Eyre and decided to write Bertha Mason to come from Jamaica. We don't know if it was Bronte's intention to replicate imperialist English stereotypes about people from the Caribbean, from the colonies, as savage and other because she actively believed them and thought they were justified. We don't know if maybe she made an intuitive decision because for her, living in these imperialist times, seeing someone like Bertha's other was just normal. Or maybe she thought that Bertha, who came from such a different part of the world, would feel out of place in England, and that would make it more plausible that she'd descend into madness. We have no idea. Maybe it was something completely different. But that doesn't mean that we can't point out that this colonial othering, this replicating of these stereotypes, is something that Jane Eyre does. We have the right to point that out, no matter what the intention was. And that is death of the author. The effect of the text matters more than the author's intention. And this example of Jane Eyre also shows that death of the author solves a common problem, because a lot of the time we simply don't know what the author's intention was. So even if we try to look for the author's intention specifically, we don't actually know if we found it. We can't know it, because a lot of the time we don't know what the intention is. And that would be not only very limiting, but also really unsatisfying. We are looking for a correct answer, and we can never know if it's correct. We are like children asking their teachers if their answer to a question was right, rather than to emancipate ourselves as readers and look beyond black and white, right or wrong, but to look at all the colors in between. Death of the author is the birth of the reader, because it says that what we as readers, viewers, listeners, what we make of a book, a film, a piece of music matters. What we extract from a work, from its plot, its style, word choice, color palette, costuming, soundtrack, whatever it may be, what we extract from these conscious and unconscious elements of the work matters. Our individual perspectives, our ways of looking at texts and understanding them that are shaped by our different experiences and our different fields of knowledge, they matter. Unless we just uncritically project our views and personal experiences on a work without actually looking at the work, these personal factors don't falsify our interpretations. If you and I were to watch the same film or read the same book, we would probably interpret some elements of it the same, but we'd disagree on others. We'd probably focus on different details and pay attention to different elements of the work. And this is all colored by our own experiences, our interests, our pre-existing knowledge, and we'd come up with complementary, perhaps clashing, but continually expanding readings. That wouldn't mean that one of us is right and one of us is wrong. Not at all. Combined, our thoughts would make the work and the cultural landscape overall deeper and richer and more colorful. To the infinite mosaic of analyses and ideas that exist, we can all add our own little stone. Whew, that was a lot, wasn't it? A lot of theory and pathos. But I hope I didn't repeat myself too much. I also hope you enjoyed this episode all the same. It is one that's very close to my heart, and that I hope I can inspire you to go out and look at the rich world of media and culture out there and explore and analyze to your heart's desire. I'm sure you will find something other people haven't thought of before, and that would be absolutely fantastic. And while you're out in the world, don't forget to follow the first rule of Midnight Culture Club and tell everyone you meet, and especially the people you discuss films and books and controversial album covers with, about Midnight Culture Club. If they like arguing about this kind of stuff, I'm sure this is the right place for them. And you, dear listener, who has bravely endured being double-teamed by the 12th November Literature Scorpios, thank you for your time, and I hope to see you again soon, here on the Nocturnal Side. Sweet dreams and good night.